Good morning again, everyone, and welcome to week 4. You all are doing wonderful work, so keep it up. I do have a quick reminder, since we'll be changing directions a little bit next week. We do have those 2 different types of discussions in this course, and each is identified each week as one or the other. You'll see your first formal essay discussion next week, and we have just a few of these throughout the course. So I wanted to give you a quick reminder before we get to next week. The formal essay discussions are assigned in part to help prepare you for both the midterm and the final essay exams, and to help you prepare for college level writing in general, which is often formal in nature as a requirement. So formal writing is much like it sounds. It's formal in nature. You'll avoid colloquialisms, you'll avoid juvenile affectations, and so on, but you will also write in third-person formal language using an objective point of view, meaning that you will not address yourself at all. On the other hand, our reflections, which we've been doing up to this point, those are informal. Reflections should still focus on the mechanics like grammar and spelling, of course, but you're welcome to use your own point of view, and you're encouraged to offer personal perspectives. I always also encourage you to look for an aha moment, finding connections between the stories and the world as you know it, or between the character and another character in literature, or even a well-known figure or type of person in the world. What a reflection shouldn't do is focus really heavily on personal experiences that apply just to you. For example, if this character is much like your cousin, your reader will struggle to make a connection because your reader probably doesn't know your cousin. But on the other hand, if the story reminds you of the time you sat in the ER waiting for your trip into the room in a major city, but where you saw firsthand how people of different races and social classes can be treated, you can make that more relevant to the world that we all are a part of together. And that might be very relevant to the stories as well. This week, we will also focus on realism and naturalism. So that will be part of our reflection. And I love these 2 literary forms. I would say it takes a little time to essentially acquire a taste for realism and naturalism because they don't follow the pattern that we generally are raised on in fiction, where there's action, a problem, a pinnacle to the story, culmination of some sort, and then a resolution or something that relieves the tension. Naturalism and realism don't follow this general pattern because that's not really how life works. So realism, as its name implies, endeavors to bring to life realistic characters and scenarios. Realism is character-driven with little focus on a plot, or at least on the type of plot with which we're familiar. Realism is sometimes dark, sometimes satirical, sometimes comical, but I would say that the major tone or mood to realism is often dissonance. If you're familiar with music, you know that musical dissonance happens when there's a clash of notes, or there's a lack of harmony, and the same is true in writing. Dissonance happens when major elements of the story clash, or there's tension, which often leaves a reader with uncomfortable emotions because very often this is completely unresolved at the end of the story. You're likely to feel this when you read Katherine Mansfield's Miss Brill. I first read this story in high school myself, probably about 17 years ago. And I brought it back to this class because it stood out to me that much at that time. And so now, even, close to 2 decades later, it's something that I remember reading for the first time because it had an impact on me, much like The Lottery did, which we'll read next week. But Miss Brill continues to stand out to me because it leaves me feeling genuinely heartbroken every time I read it. In just a few pages. It's a very short story. But there's more here than meets the eye. Mansfield is extremely particular about each nuance, each movement, each feeling, each sight that appears before the protagonist. She's very careful. She's very detailed. When you read it, I want you to think deeply on who this woman is at her core. Miss Brill, that is. Because even though this is fiction, you know there's a Miss Brill in probably every other neighborhood, in every town, in every country of the world. And this next sentence is important. I want you to think about what has happened in her life to lead her to experience this day exactly as she does. There are so many clues within the story, so let your critical thought take you on your own analytical journey and have fun with it. But think about the things Miss Brill says. Think about the things that are said to and about her. But also, remember to piece together the narrator's clues. The fur, for example, is significant from beginning to end. It not only says something about this particular day, but it tells us things about Miss Brill's past. And in the end, it tells us what we need to know about the next day for her, and the next, and the next. Even the little treat that she gets on some Sundays is pretty significant. And it says a lot about her and her experience. So pay attention to that as well. Let it sit for a day or two if you can after you read it to let your ideas marinate a little bit before you start writing. This piece is shorter, so there's a balance between this one and To Build a Fire, which is a longer story. To Build a Fire is a naturalist story. Naturalism will usually include pretty specific elements. There's often an inherent pessimism to each piece. The tone or mood is often dark, and death or serious trials will usually be included. There's a strong notion of fate or destiny. There's a causal plot, and the reader is often placed in the scene after it has started or in the middle. So there's usually not a substantial backstory. The reader is placed in the scene and it just takes off and almost asks the reader to catch up a little bit. The setting is super significant, and symbolism is usually used. The third-person narratives are also often used, typically in a limited way, meaning the narrator doesn't pretend to know what the protagonist is thinking. Finally, men and women are often their most animalistic selves in these pieces, reverting to survival mode, to survive, or to exist. You'll see most of these things in the classic story we're reading this week, Jack London's To Build a Fire. Again, this one is a little longer and a little slower at first, so don't read it when you're tired. Once you get into it, it's really fascinating and beautifully written. Try to imagine yourself in this situation, lost in the freezing cold wilderness. And when I say freezing, I'm talking about a level of cold that most of us will never experience in our lifetimes. How would you survive? What would you feel? Who would you think about? What would drive you? This character is not unlike other characters or real people we know, but his qualities exist almost on the next level. He's a simple man, but it's his simplicity that makes him and his story so compelling, so complex, and so fantastic. I hope you'll enjoy the stories and the reflections, and have a wonderful week, everyone.